faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Club. Today, I'll be interpreting a book titled Against Their Will. The theme of this book is quite dark, covering the history of human experimentation in American medicine. Against Their Will refers to violating children's consent, making them victims of human experiments. When discussing human experimentation, people first think of Germany and Japan during World War II. In Nazi concentration camps, doctors threw Jews and POWs into icy water to test endurance, removing bones and nerves without anesthesia. In Japan's Unit 73, live humans were used to test plague weapons for warfare. Such cruel medical experiments were deemed crimes against humanity and strictly banned post-221. But this book reveals that the U.S., representing justice, had actually begun various human experiments long before 222. After World War II, America's obsession with human experimentation not only continued but peaked during the Cold War. So, why did this happen in America? There are two reasons. The first dates back to the immediate aftermath of W1. Back then, doctor status soared, society abandoned ethical boundaries for medical research. 1920s America, fresh from WWI, rapidly advanced into the roaring 20s. Amid this prosperity, America's medical field boomed, with constant discoveries, doctors' income and status rising steadily. Fueled by writers and journalists, doctors became literary protagonists, widely revered, medical research seen as noble and sacred. Two key figures drove this: Paul de Kreef and Sinclair Lewis. Paul de Kreef, a University of Michigan bacteriology PhD, joined the renowned Rockefeller Institute. He was both researcher and writing enthusiast. In 1922, he wrote Microbe Hunters, expressing his views on American medicine. He deemed American medicine arrogant and immature. Wasn't that a veiled jab at the Rockefeller Institute? So this book brought him social attention and also cost him his job at Rockefeller. From then on, he embarked on a new career path, becoming a journalist focused on the medical industry's development. At this time, he met Sinclair Lewis, who was very famous then, and later became the first American Nobel Prize winner in literature. After hearing some medical stories from Kreef, Lewis began to conceive his own novel writing. In 1925, he published the highly acclaimed novel Aerosmith. The protagonist, Aerosmith, is a genius scientist eager to achieve major medical breakthroughs through rigorous and clever experiments. For this, he abandoned a flashy material life and devoted himself entirely to medical experiments. The book won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. And this work was adapted into a film in 1931, sparking interest in medical research among countless ordinary Americans. After collaborating with Lewis on Aerosmith, Kreef began his own independent writing. In 1926, his Microbe Hunters was published. In this book, he detailed the stories of 12 great scientists from the 17th to the 20th century, known as microbe hunters. These microbe hunters became protagonists in adventure stories. They were bold pioneers, persevering against all odds. Among them was Major Walter Reed of the U.S. Army. Dr. Walter Reed researched yellow fever. Before the 20th century, yellow fever was a severe disease. It could cause violent, high fevers and had a high mortality rate. At the time, people couldn't confirm what exactly its source of transmission was. Reed's team eventually proved that yellow fever is transmitted by a specific mosquito, not through human contact, thus conquering the disease. When determining if mosquitoes in tropical regions carried the yellow fever virus, Reed conducted human experiments, even using his own friends as subjects. There were casualties during the experiments, but Kreef believed that to achieve medical breakthroughs and save more lives, such risks were unavoidable. The doctors who conducted these experiments should be respected. After publication, this book quickly ignited the market. 100,000 copies sold out, and countless more people read it over time, deeply ingraining the image of medical researchers as aloof yet glorious. People began to believe that to make breakthroughs in medicine, researchers must break free from ethical constraints and work without restraint. Under this influence, in the early 20th century, when medical ethics hadn't been established, any research aiming for public health was excusable, even human experiments causing severe harm. The entire medical community fell into frenzy. Rigorous restraint was replaced by radicalism. To test innovative therapies, to become pioneers in their fields, to boost their prestige, all threw themselves into vigorous human experimentation. But human experiments required subjects. Relying solely on volunteers couldn't meet the enormous demand. Moreover, if volunteers suffered widespread harm, the experimenters faced significant risks. That's when children from asylums and orphanages became ideal targets, socially overlooked, experimenting on them faced little resistance or backlash. But wait, isn't America supposed to value equality? Why did such discrimination emerge? This leads to the second crucial reason America dared conduct human experiments. Pre-WN eugenics theories gained popularity. American society lost sympathy for the weak, creating perfect test subjects. The concept of eugenics was proposed in 1883 by Britain's Sir Francis Galton. He believed genetics influenced everything, not just physical traits like skin and features, but also psychological and emotional qualities. Intelligence, sociability, even societal contributions, all were determined by heredity. Based on this, Galton argued human progress required artificial intervention, replacing natural selection. Specifically, encourage elites to have more children while restricting or eliminating reproduction rights for the underclass, especially those with congenital diseases. Eugenics quickly spread to America, linking to population quality and national destiny. Initially, eugenics focused more on the positive aspect, improving unfavorable genetic traits and enhancing quality genes to boost national population quality. But soon, the more operational negative eugenics took dominance. This approach controlled births of inferior populations, eliminating undesirable genes from the national gene pool. Orphans, prostitutes, prisoners, alcoholics, the mentally disabled, and physically impaired all became targets for elimination under negative eugenics. They were viewed as social cancers draining national resources. To prevent social chaos, they needed effective control, isolated in specialized asylums and hospitals. In late 19th, early 20th century America, a vigorous eugenics fervor unfolded, significantly impacting two domains. The first was medicine, where sterilization surgeries gained popularity. In 1893, Dr. Hoyt Pilcher, an asylum superintendent, castrated over 70 boys at a Kansas institution for feeble-minded children. This act faced no criticism. Instead, it received widespread approval from the American medical community. Sterilizations increased afterward, with many doctors gaining fame. In 1910 alone, over 20 papers advocating sterilization were published. Amid this medical climate, 12 U.S. states passed sterilization laws. Prominent figures, including former President Theodore Roosevelt, supported sterilization, showing eugenics' societal permeation. The second domain was education, where eugenics knowledge became common sense. From late 19th to early 20th century, eugenics entered curricula at Harvard, Columbia, Chicago University, and other institutions. By the 1930s, this expanded to over 100 institutions, reaching tens of thousands of graduates. And this eugenics fervor irrevocably altered vulnerable groups' fates. Those in power or future elites lost sympathy, no longer seeing them as equals. With this logic, people in institutions and disability hospitals became medical test subjects by default. Performing sterilizations, testing new therapies, and developing drugs no longer carried moral burdens. For example, the famous activist Charles Davenport was both a eugenics promoter and advocate for pushing inferior groups into laboratories. He established research bases specifically to train and educate mentally challenged children for studying developmental deficiencies. He also collaborated with the New Jersey Training School for Feeble-Minded Children and maintained long-term cooperation with a refuge for the feeble-minded near New York. And in a 1927 letter to base director Little, he mentioned collecting physiological assessments of 100 boys over 3 to 4 years. Now, he wanted to compare these with children having congenital disorders from other institutions. Guided by Davenport, human researchers turned to these innocent children who couldn't control their fates. Medical breakthroughs using these subjects would bring researchers fame and institutions prestige. Thus, institutions provided as many subjects as researchers wanted. Dr. Kligman, who led human fungus research, said, "You can vaccinate confined subjects at will, study disease onset precisely, and biopsies are readily available." In a severe scalp trauma study, Kligman scraped 8 children's scalps with blunt blades until serum blood mixture secreted profusely, then placed 10 fungus-infected hairs on the scraped areas. The hairs stuck to bleeding spots, transmitting fungal infections. Through this, Kligman gained extensive observations for his medical paper. Yet this cruelty left children suffering lifelong fungal pain. All right, we've now clarified America's 2 main reasons for accepting human experimentation. First, doctors' elevated status and the sanctification of medical endeavors. To cure diseases, doctors could do anything. Second, eugenics eliminated sympathy for the vulnerable. Experiments on genetically inferior people caused no guilt. Understanding these attitudes explains America's approach to human experimentation. After 221, despite global consensus to prevent abuse and regulate human experiments, these progressive ideas were never prioritized in America. As the US-Soviet Cold War erupted, human experiments expanded in scale, participants, and projects. Here, we should first introduce the post-WPY medical ethics standards. From December 1946 to August 1947, 23 Nazi German doctors and medical staff were sentenced to death or long imprisonment for conducting cruel human experiments on concentration camp prisoners during World War II. 88, this was the historically famous doctors' trial. The Allies, led by the US and Soviet Union, subsequently established the Nuremberg Code. This code regulating human experiments had 10 principles. Foremost was voluntary consent without coercion. Other principles included experiments must be based on thorough scientific knowledge, minimize suffering, and prohibit experiments expected to cause death or disability. The Nuremberg Code represented progressive thinking. However, its introduction coincided with Cold War policies and intensifying US-Soviet rivalry. This code was ignored by the American medical community from the outset. Many US doctors reported no emphasis on the Nuremberg Code during training. Those aware of it sought ways to bypass its restrictions. This was most evident when medical research was tied to national security. As Soviet power grew, America was gripped by fear of communist subversion. If nuclear war erupted, how could people survive and recover from radiation? What if biological warfare happens? How do we develop effective vaccines? If the USSR infiltrated spies for subversion, how could we use mind control to capture them all? Well, these cutting-edge research topics were all tied to Cold War threats. In 1993, the Boston Globe headline exposed how Harvard and MIT used innocent children at Fernald State School for radioactive research during the Cold War. This report revealed how boldly and radically human experiments were conducted under national security justifications. Fernald School was massive, serving as a key eugenics practice site. Since the late 1940s, Harvard and MIT maintained close ties with Fernald. luring children into experiments with outings like ball games and trips. These children were isolated in separate rooms. Daily injections, blood draws, and forced consumption of radioactive laced breakfasts were routine. Sponsored by the Atomic Energy Commission, nurses monitored children defecating in special containers to collect radioactive samples. Their perpetrators claimed radiation doses were harmless, experimenting on vulnerable children and threatening them when they tried to quit revealed utter cruelty. Such atrocities persisted unchecked from late 19th century eugenics until 1970s scandals forced reform. During decades of frenzied experimentation, subjects endured lifelong disabilities or death. What immense harm did these experiments cause? For instance, to study syphilis transmission, the U.S. Public Health Service authorized the Tuskegee study in 1932, officially the study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. Lured by promises like free treatment, 399 Black men with syphilis became test subjects without their knowledge. The experiment's inhumanity lay in researchers hiding the truth, telling patients they had bad blood, not syphilis, and providing ineffective medication, just vitamins and aspirin, with no real effect. Even more chilling, after penicillin became an effective syphilis treatment in 1947, researchers still deceived Macon County patients, continuing to study syphilis progression while withholding essential treatment. The Tuskegee Research Group published their first medical data in 1934 and kept updating it. This wasn't secret in American medical circles, yet all doctors remained silent. The study continued until 1972, when an AP reporter exposed it using leads from a former public health official. The exposure caused immediate uproar across America, especially among Black and minority communities. By the study's end, only 74 patients remained alive. Of the original 399 subjects, 29 died directly from syphilis, 100 from complications, 40 spouses contracted syphilis, 19 children had congenital syphilis. After exposure, America finally began regulating unethical experiments. All experiments now required oversight committee review and verification of subjects' informed consent. Using asylums, orphanages, hospitals, and prisons to experiment on vulnerable groups was challenged, gradually declining until eliminated. So, over 50 to 60 years, countless cruel cases occurred beyond Tuskegee: electroshock therapy, mind control, brainwashing. These experiments inflicted immense physical and psychological harm on participants. Next, I'll specifically talk about lobotomy. So-called lobotomy involves using tools to damage the frontal lobe and sever its connection to the brain's central areas. The frontal lobe is a crucial part of the human brain with complex functions. It's generally linked to memory, judgment, analysis, and personality, as you can imagine. If this part is damaged, even if they don't become a vegetable only able to eat and breathe, they'll lose mental impulses and become demented or mentally impaired. In the early 20th century, people had very limited knowledge of the brain, and there were few good ways to treat neurological diseases. In 1935, Portuguese doctor Egas Moniz inserted a metal tool like an apple core into the brains of over 20 anxiety and psychiatric patients during an experiment, then destroyed a region. He hoped this would treat various mental illnesses. The experimental results seemed very good. Those who underwent the surgery became quiet and easier to manage, leading to widespread acceptance of lobotomy. Moniz himself won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this contribution. Soon, the procedure spread to America and became popular, driven by Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman later refined the lobotomy method, inventing ice pick therapy. The ice pick is a thin, long steel probe. The procedure was simple. First, heavy electric shocks were given to the patient to knock them out. Then, the doctor would drive an ice pick, about 18 centimeters long, into the bone, right below the eyelid, opposite the eye socket. The doctor lightly tapped the bottom of the ice pick with a small hammer so it pierced through the bone and nasal bridge into the brain. The doctor then rotated the ice pick to sever the white matter connecting the prefrontal cortex to other brain parts. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Freeman heavily promoted ice pick therapy and even invited media to cover his work. Because of this, his procedure gained widespread adoption in America. It wasn't stopped until the 1960s amid widespread controversy. In just one summer of 1952, Freeman performed a surgery on 228 patients. From start to finish, Freeman performed this surgical procedure on thousands of people. Even more horrifying is that among the surgical subjects were not only diagnosed psychiatric patients, but also perfectly normal children and adults, simply because their families found them difficult to discipline or emotionally unstable. And Freeman performed the lobotomies, making him one of history's most notorious doctors. With that, the book's content is essentially presented. Its author, through extensive research and investigation, not only shows us the reasons and processes behind America's human experiments, but also the cruel harm they inflicted. What people today need to reflect on more is whether our era might also breach ethical and moral limits in the name of science and progress, harming our own kind without restraint. All right, that concludes our interpretation of Against Their Will. The reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you tomorrow.